Hello, everyone. My name is Pelin Oğuz. I'd like to welcome you all to our program that we prepare as Istanbul Policy Center, Sabancı University, Stiftung Mercator Initiative in collaboration with Medyascope. And today we will be talking about the post-corona world. We will be visiting the age of anger, understanding the effects of digitalization, polarization. We have three guests, and our guest of honor is our Mercator IPC Senior Fellow, Pankaj Mishra. We know him through his excellent books and writings. He's a multiple award-winning renowned Indian writer who writes extensively on liberalism, democracy, in various media outlets like New York Times, The Guardian, and Bloomberg. And we are also very fortunate to have our second guest with us today, who is the president of Sabancı University, Professor Yusuf Leblebici. And finally, last but not least, we have our director of Istanbul Policy Center, Professor Fuat Keyman. We have been going through this unprecedented times challenged by multiple crises at once. Like we have the climate crisis, economic crisis, coupled with the health crisis, with the COVID-19 pandemic. And all this uncertainty in these crises make it even more challenging and brings out anxiety, fear among individuals, as well as resentment, anger. So the loss of power, the prospect of economic decline, the unemployment triggered by the pandemic can easily create a context in which these feelings can arise. So these feelings are universal, demonstrated in different settings in the most powerful states also. So if you allow me, I'd like to start with Pankaj Mishra. Revisiting your book, Age of Anger, how would you evaluate the current situation in the world? How did we get there? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Pelin. I think, the situation, put it very simply, has gotten much worse due to two things. One, the completely calamitous 3.5 years of Donald Trump in office, where the rule book has been torn up. If that wasn't bad enough, we've had this pandemic, which certainly United States and Britain have been really struggling with, much, much more than many other countries in the world. And that has also brought home the problem in a way that was, first diagnosed for other countries about failing states and dysfunctional bureaucracies and systems. Now we find them not just in large parts of Asia and Africa, but we find them now right in the heart of the supposedly developed, advanced, modern West, Britain and America. I mean, what I was trying to do in the book was to basically point out that many countries, both in the past and the present, have suffered very, very serious crises. And these crises are financial in nature, they are economic in nature, and political in nature. And these crises are a result of particular choices, particular decisions to have a particular kind of state, have a particular kind of economy. And that there is really, in that sense, modern history, or the history of the last 200 years, is really a history of conflict and crisis. And that it was always a mistake to think that things like modernization or let me start again. It was always a mistake to think that the process of modernization, the process of moving large numbers of people from rural areas into urban areas, from an agricultural economy to an industrial economy, and now, of course, to a post-industrial economy, that these processes are relatively painless and that they're all leading us to a better and better future. I think we've struggled for far too long under the long shadow of these ideas and assumptions. And in the last decade or so, I think particularly after the financial crisis, it has become clear that no country is exempt, not even the richest country in the world is exempt from these conflicts and crises, which are, as a way, very much built into the very nature of modernization. They're always there, waiting to erupt. And in many ways, what has happened since I wrote that book, published that book in 2017, is that it's become even clearer than before that it's actually, in many ways, the countries, the cultures, the societies that had most invested in this idea of globalization, modernization, who are also now its biggest victims. It's not China, which has managed to a large extent contain the epidemic and actually restart its economy. It's actually the United States, the most important country politically, intellectually, that is in serious trouble right now. So I think what it is forcing all of us to is to re-examine many of our assumptions about politics, about the economy, and really, in a way, take a fresh look at history, take a fresh look at modern development, and see whether the goals that we had so carefully laid out for ourselves are actually achievable, or were they ever achievable, or whether we have been chasing an illusion. I mean, these are very harsh things, very difficult things to acknowledge, very painful things to reckon with. But I think as writers and intellectuals everywhere who are now living in this age of anger and can find no easy ways out of it, I think our primary task is to examine many of our own ideas and assumptions at this point.
Okay, thank you very much, Pankaj. Maybe we can also, in the second round, we can talk about how we can move from there. And I'd like to now turn to Yusuf Leblebici and maybe talk about how the technology plays a role within this, because the use of technology has been tremendously increased during the pandemic. It gained a big pace. We initially accepted it by people and used it, but we don't really know the consequences of it. We are not really aware of the safety or the possible consequences for individuals. And how do you see this digital transformation affecting people's lives in the post-corona world?
Thank you, Pelin. It is a very important aspect of the overall crisis that Pankaj is talking about. As you all know, we are submitting ourselves to technology almost without questioning these days. And billions of people are using technology willingly. And this actually leads to a situation where data and the personal information is floating around without much or without any protection at all. The consequence of this is all of this can be exploited, of course, and it is being exploited by very sophisticated algorithms running in the background. All of the services that we are using daily make use of these algorithms. It is not a secret. Everything is plainly out in the open. But the consequence of this is that people who submit themselves to technology through the use of smartphones, through the use of different social media platforms, actually provide the data that feeds this number crunching system that's running behind. And it is a matter of a decision done by only a handful of companies what actually is done with this data and with these results. So nobody is actually asking us or asking the users how to make use of the data. The technology actually acts as a sponge these days. It allows the information about everything and everybody to be sucked up and to be stored in enormous data centers. And what's being done with this data is almost completely outside of our control. People are actually aware of this. It should not come as a surprise to anyone. What I'm saying, it is not a revelation. Everybody knows this, but the acceptance of this situation is, to me, it's very, very interesting. And only 15, 20 years ago, something similar, in my opinion, would not happen, or it would happen very, very in very extraordinary circumstances. These days, in these extraordinary times that we are living in, people are submitting themselves to this very willingly, even though they know what's behind. Now, coming to the pandemic crisis, for example, right from the start, from the very first few weeks of the pandemic situation, there were proposals floating around that actually lead to restriction of movement, restriction of freedoms in very highly developed countries in the West, which was first shocking to many of us, but then very quickly we adapted to this situation, and then we accepted this as a fact of life. And then of course, technology helps a lot in these restrictions, and apparently now the narrative that is being developed in the past few months actually leads us to believe that this will be an ongoing situation, that it will not change dramatically, and then this is something that we all have to accept. Whereas only a year ago, a situation like this would have been unthinkable. So this shows us how this unquestioning acceptance of technology can help change people's attitudes very, very quickly. Social media actually has been brought forward as a very potent tool to shape people's opinions. And we have seen this over and over again, for better or for worse, but mostly for worse, that the social media and technology can be misused. And also in the context of the pandemic situation now, we are facing a situation of excessive fear that actually it forces people to step back from their usual position of demand for freedom and demand for liberties, and then willingly give up their position, so that they actually abandon their basic freedoms, and this actually is something that is quite instructive to all of us. I am on the technology side of the story. I am, from my technical background, I am one of the people who actually designs this technology, and we know how potent it is. I believe the general public is also becoming aware of the potential of this, and this awareness will become hopefully more and more prominent, so that people will think twice before they make decisions based on what technology is telling them. So this is how I feel. Maybe we can expand on this a little bit in the second round.
Thank you very much, Yusuf Leblebici. Yeah, we have been actually seeing the extensive use of technology and people accepting it willingly, as you're saying, because of the fact that they want to feel secure. So they have a choice between like a security and individual freedoms, and this becomes really important in our times, so that people accept what has been offered to them and easily accepted, that they are content about accepting it. So maybe now I turn the floor to Fuat Keyman. Maybe Fuat Hocam, can you also maybe elaborate on this a little bit more and talk about the global trends in terms of emotional freedoms, polarization, freedom of speech? How do they come about? What are the restrictions in terms of like containing this anger and maybe releasing that anger?
Actually, let me bring together what Pankaj said and what Yusuf Hoca said, and go a bit beyond by reformulating what they have said. You know, we have a Pankaj in his books tell the story brilliantly. We have a story narrative since 16th century. It's called modernity, Western modernity, or capitalism. And from a philosophical point of view, we actually approach this narrative in such a way that it contains two promises. One actually is progress. Of course, progress comes with the free market, industrial revolution, first, steam, then railways, then, knowledge now, automation, fourth industrial, first, second, third, and fourth industrial revolutions. Progress brings richness, progress brings technology, technological advancements. And but we say that modernity has kept this promise. We have actually, sort of non-stop linear movement towards betterment, technology in progress, rich, everything. The second the part actually is liberty, freedom, democracy, and the idea has been for a long, long time that modernity has not kept the second promise. We had progress but not liberty. We had progress but not real democracy. All the actually Frankfurt School onwards, all the critical theory has been based on criticizing this unpromised of Western modernity. And we have sort of our minds, our cognitive sort of mind has been shaped by this two sort of dimensions. One is kept progress, and another actually is not really kept liberty and democracy and freedom. And when we have tried to establish some kind of balance between progress and liberty, and then we actually have believed that the system is able to restore itself by establishing sort of some kind of balance in critical conjunctures after the wars, after the critical crises. So far, this is the story of globalization goes like this too. But what Pankaj and Yusuf Hoca correctly pointed out, when we came today, the present, and shaped by COVID-19. Of course, COVID-19 did not create new things. For me, actually, he has triggered the process of, like the system is collapsing. The system actually is no longer able to restore itself, as if everything is okay and it is possible to do a little reform and restore the things. And I think to begin with, in 1945, for instance, we had actually atomic bomb, the technology and liberty relationship. We have to control technology, everything. But today, similarly, we are looking at this relationship between progress, technology, and liberty and individual security. We actually maybe not atomic bombs, but we have extremely significant sophisticated technologies, social media, Google's, Trump's, all of these technologies, but they are actually maybe not killing, but they are really controlling our mind, our behavior, the way that we act, the way that we approach things. And the whole liberty part, the individual part, turned out to be the product to be shaped, reshaped, and they control us. So in this sense, I think this progress liberty relationship, progress turned out to be kind of a little evil, maybe Hobbesian, sort of beast, is really, maybe not killing, but really reshaping, manipulating our, behaviors, our, sort of attitudes, our way of approaching things and everything, from manipulating elections to our consumer preferences, from our way of talking about liberties and our actually submitting ourselves, being subject to technology and all of these things. And as a matter of fact, at the end, we have a very, very significant crisis of the Western modernity and this whole idea of globalization as West, globalization as capitalism, globalization as modernity. And today, in every front, we are talking about the kind of decline in the belief in the West that it is possible to restore the system in itself. I think we need a much more radical understanding of how globalization works and everything. And as a matter of fact, as Pankaj said in the beginning of his remarks, in the pandemic, it is very interesting that most have suffered so far are starting with United States, Italy, France, Britain, Spain. The whole Western countries are been very, very weak. Like even, for instance, from international relations point of view, we have a new term called failed state to describe what goes on in Syria, what goes on in Libya, what goes on in Yemen, kind of thing. But interestingly, I have read a bunch of articles in which this idea or the concept of failed state is used to describe the United States and the Donald Trump, like this whole United States failure to deal with COVID-19. When we look at the numbers and everything. So in this sense, I think COVID-19 has created a situation where we have actually individuals as being individual are not really able to make actually choices freely, are not able to define themselves freely. They are being manipulated by social media, by leaders, demagogues and everything. And we have a very significant crisis of globalization, crisis of modernity as West. But on the other hand, let me finish with this remark and maybe kind of have a little passage to Pankaj's second second round remarks. We also recently talked about a global shift, from West to East. The rise of China, rise of Asia, and everything. But when we used to actually in sociology to talk about this Western modernity, non-Western modernity, multiple modernities, alternative modernities. But on the other hand, we have actually see also that as I see it, a very, very significant challenge in front of us. This global shift to power to the East, global shift to power to China is not solution either. When we look at China, when we look at India, when we look at Russia, when we look at even Turkey, we also there actually very big push for progress, big push for actually, not liberty, but power, hegemony kind of thing. So in this sense, in addition to the crisis of the West, we have actually also, universally speaking, crisis of the global, history. And I think we are going through very tough times, not only because of COVID-19, but because of the sort of a multiple crises, started maybe, the collapse of Yugoslavia, 9/11, 2008 crisis, 2009 Arab Spring. But when we come here, right now, the present, we need to really radically change our idea of how to deal with technology, how to deal with progress, how to deal with liberty. And we realize that just simple reform, just simple, governance is not going to be enough to actually deal with this multiple crises of globalization, decline of democracy, being sort of subject to progress, technology and everything. I think we are living in a very important crossroads where we should be maybe radical, in our way of dealing with the whole history, both global, Western and non-Western. And COVID-19 is the episode, but the final episode maybe to show that the world as it is not going to go this way.
Thank you very much, Fuat Keyman. And maybe taking after Fuat Keyman, maybe how I can ask Pankaj Mishra that maybe how can we move from there? Because we were talking about this grand narrative being not very good for the people in the East. Maybe the idea of catching up, the idea of progress, modernization made them more vulnerable and caused some other anger and resentment among those nations. But how do we get out from there? Do we have an alternative that maybe we can share in terms of balancing within this global turmoil, balancing the two between democracy and this?
I think, first of all, it's very important to emphasize that the ideals of modernity should be upheld. I think if we confine ourselves to the three main important slogans, let's say, of the French Revolution: liberty, equality, and fraternity, there is nothing at all objectionable about any of these ideals. If you look at them closely, you'll realize that actually wherever you are in the world, whichever cultural, religious tradition you belong to, there is enough support in those traditions for these ideals. If you're a Muslim, the ideal of equality and solidarity would not seem alien to you. If you're a Hindu, again, ideal of freedom, that ideal might be differently achieved or differently formulated, but these are completely unobjectionable ideals. The problem arises when the means to achieve those ideals compromise them. So, to give you an instance, if you're going to achieve equality while working through a capitalist economy, unfortunately, you will always remain very distant from your ideal, because capitalist system, the way it works, it fundamentally generates inequality. It needs specialization at a very basic level. It needs specialization. In any given capitalist system, you need people doing different tasks, and they will be differently remunerated. That will create inequality right from the beginning. And that inequality, if it is not actively checked by a redistributionist state, will grow and grow and grow. And of course, if you employ slave labor, then you're creating a whole lot of levels of inequality and degradation that will haunt you for decades and decades. And that is what's happening in the United States today, is that particular history has erupted. Fraternity is going to be undermined by a socio-economic system where too much emphasis is placed upon individualism. Liberty, again, is going to be compromised because, obviously, liberty can only be achieved if there's a larger collective project, which is mostly emphasizing collective welfare and not just the liberty of a few select people. So again, I think the economic system generally chosen and generally preferred over the last 200 years has been working against those particular ideals. So now, what we're sort of left with, if you're thinking about progress, and if you're thinking about progress in connection with these particular ideals, is technology, where progress is apparent in a very simple way. You have a new smartphone model every year, and you think, actually, okay, this is really interesting. The quality of my Instagram pictures is improving every year. When you look back at some of these older Instagram posts, you realize how primitive they are, but they're only 5 years old. The photo quality has improved so much in just the last 5 years. So the idea of progress, funnily enough, is alive in this particular realm, which is that of the smartphone, that of social media. And the illusion thereby created, in a way, has started to compensate for the lack of progress, for the devastating lack of progress in almost every other realm. So you may not be able to get a proper job, but you can buy a Chinese-built smartphone, which is the case in India, and immediately hook into this larger world of self-gratification, self-recognition, of general approval, your post gets a few likes, you're delighted by this. So you have your relationship with the world is now being mediated through the smartphone and through those social media platforms. So the other goals, economic stability, liberty, equality, fraternity, in a way have almost become secondary for so many people around the world. You have this relationship with the smartphone. You do not care, as Fuat pointed out, that the data is being used. You're very happy to give up your personal data to the big Silicon Valley companies. You're very happy. You don't care at all if you're being monitored by the state. So in a very strange way, starting off with these wonderful, very high-minded ideals, we've arrived at a state where we are perfectly willing to give up our privacy, our liberty, our information, everything that makes us distinctive individuals to these big data companies. We're not really interested so much in solidarity or any kind of large political movement. Smartphones, social media has split these older solidarities, these older communities. Everyone seems to be now a hyper individualist, polishing their brands, presenting themselves on social media. So I think there's a sort of urgent need in a way to get back to some basic notions about how societies are created, what are our responsibilities as citizens of political societies or political communities. I feel like technology in many ways has been a massive distraction from reckoning with these essentially political, economic, and social problems. It has created this sort of pseudo realm where you can enjoy liberty. You can even enjoy a bit of solidarity when your post gets a lot of likes. Suddenly people are united around a particular cause and you feel a little, frisson of solidarity there. Especially when you're pursuing someone, you're persecuting someone, the trolls also invoke solidarity in many ways. So all these ideas have re-emerged, completely tainted, completely compromised in the context of this technologized, digitalized world that we live in today.
Thank you very much, Pankaj. Now I turn to Yusuf Leblebici. Maybe Yusuf Leblebici, can you comment on the way of using of this technology? Because as Pankaj was saying that this is multiplied, like the exposure is very much, and the people are using it in a way. For example, in like the Black Lives Matter movement, it was a good way. In a good way, it was used, but people, instead of trying to change things, like they express their anger, their resentment through the social media, and they think that they're done, they did their work in terms of that. Maybe can you comment on how we can go beyond this?
Truthfully, Pankaj made a very nice comment about this illusion of progress that is brought to us by technology. And it is completely true that on the one side, yes, the technological toys that we are using, they do improve every year, and it has been like this for almost throughout our lifetimes. For the past 40 years, we have seen black and white television and color television, and then the introduction of the cell phone, and then the smartphone, and then every model, etc., etc. So it is not just the past 5-6 years, but it goes back about 40 years, and it is all an illusion, mostly, which does not touch the essential parts of people's lives. It is something that keeps us busy and occupied, and it gives us the satisfaction. It gives most of the people a kind of satisfaction, although most likely on the surface, but for most people this is sufficient. And this satisfaction of involvement and the satisfaction of being heard and being seen is enough for people to assume that they are a part of a larger community and they are living in a free world, etc., which is mostly not true. And the technology, the availability of this technology actually hides many of these things. There's also an interesting aspect. Most of the technology we are talking about, we tend to speak of a linear progression, right? We speak about all three speakers actually here. We talked about this linear progression of since the introduction of modernity. This, when you look at the greater picture, is also not true. In the history of humankind, there have been many cycles where technology has been developed and then destroyed and forgotten for centuries, for millennia. And it is a cyclic situation that repeats itself. We tend to forget this. It has already happened in a smaller scale within our lifetimes. The last time humans were able to land on the moon, that was in 1972, right? So think about it. And even today, we're not even contemplating this, repeating this in anytime soon. And it will take many, many years until humans will, if they choose to do so, again, be able to do so. It is not a matter of choosing or deciding to go, but even when you decide to go, it will take at least a few decades until humans will be able to do this again. So this actually represents a loss of capability. And clearly that capability has been lost. The United States has not been able to send anyone into even Earth orbit for 11 years. Imagine this. And this is something that is usually forgotten or neglected. If you look at a greater extent of history, there is an object that was found very close to Turkey in the Aegean Sea. It is called the Antikythera Mechanism. Some of you may know about this Antikythera Mechanism. It is actually the remnants of an astronomical clock. And it was discovered at the bottom of the sea. It was recovered, cleaned, and it dates back from 100 BC. Now, think about that. Humankind was able to create the Antikythera mechanism 100 years before Christ. And then the next time humankind was able to do anything similar was in the 1600s. So it took more than 1.5 millennia until humankind was able to do this again. So we should not take our current position as a permanent rising slope that will lead us to more and more progress. Human history shows us that it has shown rises and dips many times, and we may be, most likely, we may be living through one of these temporary illusions where we think that technological progress is leading us up, which may or may not be true in the long term. I'd like to finish with one remark about the role of ethics in technology. At the moment, we as developers of technology have a very agnostic view of the ethical consequences of what we do. Usually this question almost never comes up, and if it does, it is glossed over very quickly, saying that progress is good, point. But it is more than that. And especially people who are involved in developing technology should be more aware of the social consequences and ethical consequences of everything that they do. But this also points to a lack of education on our part to think even about these concepts, because these concepts of ethics and social impact are never taught to people who develop technology. And then you have a cadre of people who are willingly and very capably develop these little toys that we are all happy with, meaning, for example, the smartphones, meaning the social media platforms, and the larger impact of this is never considered. It is being considered by the companies that actually implement it, of course, but then it's too late. So this is also something that we need to think about seriously, especially now I speak with my hat as an educator, that whenever we teach people about technology, we also should teach people about the ethical consequences of that technology at the same time. So these are my thoughts.
Thank you very much, Yusuf Leblebici. Now I turn to Fuat Keyman, and maybe we can talk about a little bit more, elaborate a bit more on people losing, the individuals losing themselves in these illusions and how it affects them, and also the role of ethics and morality, and how do they play a role within these current crises.
And let me make a couple of brief remarks on what Pankaj and Yusuf just said, and then maybe leave the floor to Pankaj for the last words. I think we have time. You know, in the beginning of sort of globalization as capitalism, you know, the first industrial revolution, the British Empire, and especially India, we had actually a company called the East India Company, and it played an extremely important role for globalization. Like Pankaj, I was listening to a friend of mine in London, Engin Aysen, and he actually defines technology companies like Apple, Amazon, you know, Google, everything, you know, New East Indian Company, not but companies, as empire kind of thing, like just Amazon's economic strength is bigger than Turkey's budget. I think it just goes over a trillion. And I was reading a book called Surveillance Capitalism, and these companies are the richest ever in actually world history, in the time of capitalism or neoliberalism. So in this sense, you know, we have actually talking about the companies as empires, and they are actually creating a new vision of the world in which we have a big push for technology, but very, as Yusuf just said, agnostic way. And this, you know, not much discussion about morality, not much discussion about ethics. As a matter of fact, if there is a discussion, they do it, you know, sort of like how are we going to balance between technology and morality, technology and ethics, and similarly, like how are we going to actually like medicine, you know, get rid of or deal with the side effects of our what we do, but they are doing extremely significant, maybe, you know, like unique thing that they are actually shaping our minds, manipulating our minds. Every time you use a telephone, and you know, then you are in the system, and then you know, your freedom of speech goes away, and your freedom of choice goes away. Even the countries, you know, this you know, Cambridge Analytica thing is like the whole American elections coming, and they manipulate elections without, you know, like how we don't, us knowing how they do it, but they do it. And then this whole concept of, we didn't refer to it, but post-truth is actually includes a reference to truth, but truth manipulated by these companies. I think this has a big impact on ourselves, individuals, as Fuat Keyman, as Pankaj Mishra, as Yusuf Leblebici, to everybody. And I think the general trend is they created a new kind of subjectivity, new idea of individual, which is very neurotic, which is very, as you know, like fearful, insecure, you know, so ontological insecurity. But that's, you know, the of course there was also reference to 9/11. There was also reference to actually economic crises. Now the COVID-19, all of these together. But in each case there is a reference to technology. We actually have a, you know, sort of a tendency in individuals, very independent, atomistic, but very nervous, you know, very insecure, very fearful, and then so on the one hand we have this kind of stuff, and as Pankaj points out very correctly, from this type of, you know, insecure, you know, fearful, neurotic citizens, neurotic, you know, individuals, you know, rather than critic, rather than transformative, you know, appeals or calls, you have a big fear, you have a big resentment. And so I think resentment replaces critic, and everybody resents. And, you know, we see it actually in recent, you know, Black Lives, and people are outside. Some criticize, but most of them, you know, like they actually attack and everything because they don't know what to do like this. The system creates like this. But on the other hand, let me finish what this. There is a little space for hope, and this hope actually is that, and the more we see the you know the illusion of progress, the more we see actually the results of this over technology, you know, sort of related pattern of history or whatever, and all the more we see that we are no longer able to make a distinction between progress and liberty, but progress itself with technology, you know, eats up liberty and everything, hijacks liberty. Then, you know, from individual point of view, that maybe we should actually talk about anti-growth. We could talk about anti-progress. We could actually not actually accept the recommendations that we are actually given by Google, by Netflix, by things like or do something individually about climate change, do something individually about what goes on in the world. And I call it actually moral self. I think there is a, you know, sort of a, you know, space where we could talk about, you know, how to actually return to morality, how to, as Yusuf just said, pose the questions of ethics and technology in a much more serious way, not like sort of only to reform the system, but really change the way that we actually deal with nature, deal with others. And as a matter of fact, you know, as Zygmunt Bauman says, you know, like ourselves, like, you know, we have to actually, you know, think about ourselves. What are we doing? How are we doing? Well, how we approach, you know, all of this. And I think rather than ethical codes outside us, coming from religion, coming from, you know, certain scripts, as Zygmunt Bauman says, we should actually start from ourselves and you know, with others, civil society, movements, public intellectuals, you know, all this actual television, you know, all the programs, you know, we should actually start thinking very seriously about the relationship between morality and self, ethics and technology, and we start resisting from a very micro individual level, you know, like as Fuat Keyman, what can I do about climate change, global warming, or Black Lives Matter, you know, all these technologies, and, you know, sort of start and then rebuild it. I think that's what we could do. And for instance, yesterday, as Pankaj Mishra was giving the opening lecture for our university, you know, we were referring to our students. I think it is very important to actually think about education, civic education, morality, ethics, as a way of not learning, but also changing this thing that is actually really manipulating and hijacking us.
Thank you very much. Now, maybe we can have a very quick round, and this would be the last round, and I can give you all 2 minutes to maybe comment on the others and maybe have the last remarks and comment on the way how we see ourselves and how can we improve that. Maybe we can start with Pankaj Mishra and how we see the world also.
I think, you know, just listening to Yusuf and Fuat's very thoughtful remarks, I'm thinking many ways in which a renewed concern for morality can be combined with political action has been demonstrated in recent months. I think the Black Lives Matter movement is really important in this regard, because what it did, first of all, it demonstrated that it's simply not enough to sit in your home and tweet, or to write Facebook posts, or have millions of likes or retweets. It's important to actually engage in old-fashioned political action, which is filling up the streets, going out there, demonstrating with sheer numbers the power of like-minded people. And there is something about political action. People have theorized about it. Hannah Arendt wrote about it. Gandhi demonstrated it. Political action, in a way, is the best way of realizing the modern ideals of liberty, equality, fraternity. You're there all together out on the streets. You're demonstrating, talking to other people. You're organizing. Everyone is equal. There are no real hierarchies. They're all dissolved in that moment of combined, concerted political action. And in many ways, Black Lives Matter. One reason why, after long years of complete ineffectiveness, it suddenly emerged and became this force, because in every city, every major American city, there were old-fashioned demonstrations of the kind we've known since the late 18th century, from the French Revolution onwards. People demonstrating, people shouting, people asking for their rights, people demanding that individuals be respected, their dignity be honored. And that was really breaking free from this over-digitalized world of protests and expressions of anger and frustration. I mean, even the Arab Spring, if you remember, early on, it was hailed as a Twitter revolution. It was early days of Twitter, early days also of Facebook, and a lot of American magazines focused on the people who had used Twitter in the early days to hail them as Twitter revolutionaries, Facebook revolutionaries. It was a very naive thing to do, because obviously now we know that those very same social media platforms can be very effectively deployed by authoritarian regimes and despots and dictators of every sort. And actually, what made the Arab Spring so effective wasn't the people on them, by the way. You will probably remember, these figures who were suddenly turned into celebrities. Nobody remembers them, because in the end, what really changed things were people on the streets, in the squares. They were the real forces for change. Likewise with BLM. So I do feel like there is hope, and that has been demonstrated by the achievements of the BLM. They're still very small, they're still very minor, but nevertheless they exist. The fact that Black Lives Matter is now on the agenda. Almost every politician in the West has had to acknowledge that. You just 2 years back, 3 years back, you had that football player who was completely ostracized for taking the knee. Now senators are taking the knee. Congressmen are taking the knee. Cricketers in England are taking the knee. So there has been, a change there, and it has been brought about really by old-fashioned forms of political action, which, as you said, combine political concern with an ethical concern.
Thank you very much, Yusuf Leblebici. Now you have the floor for 2 minutes for your final remarks.
One thing I like to bring back the pandemic crisis on the table as my closing remark. As we all noticed, these past few months have, on top of everything that we're talking about, this few months have forced us, all of us, to retreat back into our homes and out of public sphere, which is also actually cutting away the possibilities of socializing. And we should reclaim, in any ways possible, reclaim our social lives back, but without, of course, endangering the health of other individuals and ourselves. But I am sure there are ways of safely reclaiming our social lives back. Because if we as individuals accept this new normal as being secluded in our homes and everybody holed up in his or her own little sphere and completely isolated from the rest of the society will break down very, very quickly. And this is what I fear. And we have to be very careful about, and then this actually goes hand in hand with what just Pankaj said. This summer, we have seen all these demonstrations on the streets, despite the fact that there was also the scare about the pandemic. Of course, it was done in a very unsafe way, and it led to the blow up afterwards. But there must be, there must be other ways of maintaining the social presence of individuals instead of holding up in their own little sphere, so that we can go on as a society. Otherwise, it will be just a bunch of scattered individuals, which is not equal to society. That's something else. So we have to be very careful about this.
Thank you very much. Now, Fuat Keyman, you have the floor for.
I like to use my 2 minutes to really thank Pankaj Mishra to accept our invitation to come to Istanbul as the Istanbul Policy Center Stiftung Mercator visiting senior fellow. Last night, it's actually Monday night, he gave the opening speech to our university's 2020-2021 academic year, and also he did a very good important webinar with Istanbul Policy Center and Stiftung Mercator. And it is very important in these days, in these very, very hectic and difficult days and times, for someone to come physically to Turkey to share his ideas with us. So I like to thank him. And so also I refer to sort of 2 books of his really actually was been important to me. One of the actually Ruins of Empire, which is actually extremely important book on understanding modernity now, Western modernity, globalization, the age of anger. We actually talk about it today. And his new book, Land Fanatics, actually is also the decline of democracy, decline of leadership and everything. I think it's extremely important commentaries. But Pankaj's commentaries also, in addition to books, commentaries have been published in New York Times, Guardian, New Yorker, and for instance, the one on Ahmet Hamdi Tanpınar is very favorite of me, and then where he actually, talks about his very important novel, which is one of my favorites, Saatleri Ayarlama Institute, with relation to Orhan Pamuk, and how literature, how actually that literary critic actually, is very, very helpful for us to understand, not only that day, but also modernity and then today. And one commentary, he actually, the title of the commentary, and he actually suggests that we need new ideas rather than new faces and new leaders and everything. I took it very seriously, and I take it still very seriously, that we really need new ideas to deal with this the present, where we have COVID-19 risks, all of these actually very, very not easily, handling things. So thank you, Pankaj, for coming here and sharing your ideas and wisdom with us.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank you all very much. Fuat Hoca did a very good closing part of the program. So thank you, Pankaj Mishra, Yusuf Leblebici, Fuat Keyman, for being with us today and sharing your comments, thoughts on the world. We will see, and also we would like to say thank you to our online audience, and we will see you next week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.